Hi, dear listeners. This is Kate Riga. I'm here to make a quick pitch that you consider becoming a TPM Prime member. TPM has used the member model for over a decade now, and our loyal members are the only reason we've been able to weather the turbulence of the media landscape and avoid the fate that has befallen so many other independent outlets. For $70, you get no paywall, fewer ads, access to the Hive member forum, a members only newsletter, and more. For $140 a year, you get all of that, plus no ads at all. Without our members, there is no podcast, not to mention that I'm out of a job. Thank you so much for listening and supporting us. We couldn't do it without you.
Hi, this is Josh Marshall, and this is the Josh Marshall Podcast featuring Kate Riga. First, I want to thank everybody who came out to our event in Chicago last week, a week and a day. We're recording this episode one day later than we normally do. We're recording Thursday, May 22nd, just after noon. We had a great time with you folks in Chicago. It was awesome, right? And I'm hoping that those of you who are not from Chicago, didn't get a chance to join us. You've already heard the episode. You heard the very real and legit crowd there. Everybody was really enthusiastic. I thought it was a great venue. We got to meet lots of you after the podcast with the drinks and everything. So I just wanted to thank everybody who came. It was we've had over the years, we've had a few events in Washington D.C. and in New York, so I've personally met a number of our TPM fans in New York and DC, but I got to meet a bunch of fans that I had never met in person since we hadn't done one in Chicago, and I think I speak for the probably not just Kate, but the rest of probably maybe more than half of the TPM team was there at the event just to kind of meet everybody. So we had a great time. I just wanted to thank everybody for that. Kate, before we're just more on this, anything you want to share on that front?
Yeah, it it's so nice to talk to you guys afterwards. It can the the downside of podcasting is that it can feel one way, it's like you're just kind of speaking out into the ether, and so it's really gratifying to actually, talk to people who listen. And I will say that, after these nights, the staff always kind of, gathers at the end of the event and hangs out for a little bit, and everyone was just really up, like really gratified by kind of hearing all the nice things that you guys said and how much, you appreciate our work. And it makes it feel like less of a lonely enterprise, more that we're all part of this like big army of of people, and it's nice to get back in touch with that sometimes. So yeah, I had a really good time. It was very soul replenishing for me in a period where, doing this work every day can be, especially right now, just really deadening, and it's so negative all the time. So this was a really nice kind of disruption of that.
Yeah, no, it's funny. There is something I've thought a lot about as when I was still the publisher of TPM, and obviously I'm still involved in the kind of the publishing enterprise of TPM. I read somewhere once in a discussion of publishing, thinking about the business of publishing, that the New Yorker is actually a club, and the publication is this thing in the center that the club sort of coalesces around. But the thing itself is a club. It's a community, and I think about TPM that way, right? The TPM is this community we have, and the site is the sort of center of gravity that it coheres and coalesces around. So, in any case, thank you so much. So, let's talk first, though, about we actually had some big news. It's a little hard to say whether it was surprising. These kind of we're talking about the House passed its version of the reconciliation, budget bill. I don't know, sometime overnight last night, and it's been a little up in the air maybe if it was going to happen, certainly exactly when it was going to happen. These things tend to happen, right? You don't tend to get sort of total train wrecks. There's just so much, there's so much on the line and everything. Well, first, Kate, what do you think? What is are we surprised? Are we surprised about any of the details of it, or is just kind of, we always knew they were going to get there?
Yeah, I mean, credit where credit's due, I think. Johnson pulled off something difficult, right? A lot of flanks of the party, very slim majority. As you say, I mean, they couldn't not pass this. That would be cataclysmic. This is likely the only big thing they're going to get done in this term, you know?
Yeah,
So they had to do it. And Johnson also had Trump as a really valuable backup. Like, as soon as Trump comes to the Hill and is like, pass this or I'll destroy you, that
yeah,
gets people in line. But I guess I'm surprised that he was able to do it before Memorial Day the way that he wanted to. Like, that it came together really fast, and some people were kind of carping about that, that they were sitting in committee meetings and didn't have any kind of legislation before them, and that's going to result in what you'd expect it to result in, right? Which is going to be poorly written, ambiguously written legislation that's going to have problems down the line, and I'm sure stuff will go to court and implementation will be difficult, but they got it done ultimately. It's a good lesson in the Trump era that you get the squawking from all of the contingents you expect to squawk, right? Like Chip Roy is like, I shan't add to the deficit, think of my grandchildren. And then the moderates are like, salt. Like, when my grandson asks me what I did in this time, I will say I fought for the salt deduction, right? But they all kind of either get a compromise or cave in the end. And, Chip Roy is left kind of like shaking a fist of, but I will set bright lines when this comes back from the Senate. It's like, yeah, I'm sure. So he got it done. He had a little bit of a margin. Only two people voted no. Massey, who's just going to vote no for everything from here on out. And
right.
then Warren Davidson, a kind of almost backbench hardliner that like,
Or like random randomson, like someone who's like so
totally.
backbench that we barely even know who he is. Yeah,
Yeah. And then during the vote to pass the rule, which is kind of the one that came before this, one Republican just didn't arrive on time, missed the vote. They were still able to make it happen. I mean, not least because Jerry Connolly died, so that was another a little area for wiggle room, but yeah, he got it done. And now, as we've discussed on previous pods, it's going to go to the Senate. That's almost going to be the more interesting juncture, I think, because this whole, it's been conventional wisdom forever, right? Like, if you can get entitlement cuts through the House, okay, sure, maybe you can bully them through, but Senate Republicans are supposed to be the ones who are still operating off of this, like, you know, cutting Medicare, Medicaid is the third rail. We don't, you don't touch those things. We've been burned before, kind of thing. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens there. And then to any degree that they rewrite it, Johnson's going to have to get this whole thing, through the House again, which you would presume would have a little bit less of the kind of hardliner concessions that he had to put in it to get it through the House the first time.
yeah. I mean, one thing I will say to sort of re-emphasize the point about Johnson's role here, that we do now see the pattern. Trump comes in at the end and is just fucking pass it, right? And then everybody kind of passes it. But that is also premised on Johnson getting it kind of where it needs to be for them, right? So that I think I believe, was it a $40,000 deduction for salt taxes they got it to? Okay.
Mhm.
So 40,000, you know, I mean, I think even more than in the past, they need to have no limits on that, not because of the distributional effects. We need to keep more money in blue states. If you're going to have these Republican presidents who like turn off the money to blue states, it brings it into much sharper relief that it's blue states who disproportionately fund the actual government. So that whole thing needs to change. But in terms of what they needed, what people like Mike Lawler and these people needed, which is basically uh, a non-trivial population of, kind of affluent but not super rich people who this is a big thing for, getting a $40,000 deduction that's pretty substantial, right? You need to be pretty well off to be paying a lot more than $40,000 of state income tax. So I guess my point here is that when Trump said, "Hey, you got what you need, do it," that's not a bad argument in the context of, the universe that they're operating in, right? That was a lot. It went from 10,000 to 40,000. So that's a significant thing. So in any case, my point is that, you do gotta hand it a little to Mike Johnson, that Trump coming in there at the end with that "do it," which is very effective. Johnson needs to have it pretty close for everybody to fall in line. But I do kind of wonder about this because, and you would know more about this than I do, Kate, but pretty much all of this seems dead on arrival in the Senate. Like, just a lot of this is not even close. And I'm curious what you think about this, and how much you think this is caught on, that this one rep, got a letter from the Congressional Budget Office basically confirming that this budget, if this thing passed, it would require $500 billion in cuts to Medicare, not Medicaid, Medicare. $500 billion, to be specific, $490 billion. And the reason this is that if you remember the whole kind of pay-go the last version of pay-go sequestration that was passed in 2010, that require, that if you basically what it does is if you pass a budget that increases the deficit by too much, it there are these across the board cuts, except they're not across the board. Some things don't get cut and some things do get cut. And one of the things that does get cut is Medicare. And like that's hardcore third rail stuff, $500 billion cuts to Medicare. So now even though we know that this thing is not going to pass, every Republican member of the House, except for Warren McRandomson or whatever, whoever he is, has voted for this. And you can say, yes, this is $500 billion in cuts to Medicare. So there's a lot of things they've committed themselves to that are pretty damaging. So I don't have a sense of quite what is the Senate going to do, right? Where are they on I don't think we know exactly, because
Yeah.
it's not
Everyone's
like they're
staying.
more liberal necessarily. It's not that cut and dry.
I mean, it also guys stems from historically they've been a little more insulated from the president than the House is, right? I mean, Trump can go into the House any day of the week and say, I'm going to primary your ass, and it's like, okay, you're either up in a month or at most like a year and a half, right? Like
Right.
it's a pretty potent threat. In the Senate, he can say, I'm going to primary you, and you can say, okay, I'll see you in 5 years, right? Like you just have a little more protection. Um, but yeah, I mean, part of the reconnoitered bill was also that the Medicaid cuts would kick in at the end of 2026 rather than 2029, which, clearly they were designed that way. So you could say, well, kind of not our circus, not our monkeys. So we'll kick that can down the road.
Right.
End of 2026, you still are avoiding the whole kind of they're trying to avoid the whole having midterms kind of defined by kicking people off their health care again, right? We saw
Right.
how that went in 2018, but you're putting that into the bloodstream in a big way for the presidential election, which of course Trump doesn't care about, but you would think that people in Congress would. So yeah, I mean, the only person who's really yapping in the Senate so far is Ron Johnson, who's doing the whole challenging it from the right thing, right? Like it doesn't cut enough social safety net type thing. But we haven't seen this kind of coalition of moderates grow big enough to do much of anything so far, and it's
Mm-hmm.
because you get Murkowski, you get Collins, you sometimes get McConnell, and that fourth person is hard to find. It's usually people will say like John Curtis. Mostly it seems like just because he took over for Romney, so people are casting him as Romney part 2, which
Right.
he hasn't seemed to be, right? Like you got Tillis maybe, or you've got Bill Cassidy, these people in competitive races, but then Cassidy might be eyeing the exits, not even totally clear he's going to be up again. I think conventional wisdom at this point is like Tillis is going to probably lose. So, that you see that affecting him one way or the other.
Yeah, I mean, it also, I was going to say, it also goes to what you were saying about Trump threatening challengers, because I think if you're Tom Tillis, if he says, "Oh, I'll primary you," I think Tom Tillis says, "Oh, really? Really?" Like, okay, no, you're not. So, because even so, that's not, so that's not much of a threat. And this is why I I don't have a sense of what's gonna get in or what's not gonna get in, because you could, as you say, you could kind of see the whole thing just passing, right? It's not like you say like, oh, this person means that, that there's just no way. Um, I, that McConnell comes in on, kind of rule of law kind of stuff, but the stuff we're talking about here is pretty conventional Republican stuff. I mean, stuff they're not really willing to do necessarily, but it's not like he's a guy like, "Hey, I'm not going to stand for these cuts to Medicare. I need to stand up for my." That's not Mitch McConnell, and I don't even, I, you know, I was going to say I don't even blame him, but it's not like that's not who he. That's the stuff that's all kind of, old school Republican stuff. So, uh, I don't know. I mean, as you said, they moved the implementation of these Medicaid cuts up by 2 years, but it still puts it past this election. So they're not gonna, as you said, you're not gonna have a whole storyline in 2026 with all these people, losing their health care. Not totally clear. It's always a little hard to say how much that affects the politics, because you're definitely going to have people who know they're losing their health care a few months after the election. So does that matter? It's hard to say. So I don't really. There's but the other thing here. I mean, you do have that. Again, I'm sort of waiting for people to talk about this 500 $500 billion cuts to Medicare, because when I first saw that, I was like, okay, this must be a, like, oh, try this one trick kind of, meme kind of thing, but it's not. It's actually real. And they could pass a suspension of it, but I'm not sure that's going to happen. And I think they would actually need the Democrats to help them. It's not a privilege resolution in the Senate. Uh, so I kind of wonder if that's going to come into effect. It's hard to say. It's hard to say. And there's a lot of like little things. Like there's a one thing that I think hasn't gotten a lot of attention. It's not exactly a big populist issue, but they have this up to 21% tax on college endowments, which is obviously a big deal to the same kind of target universities. But there was actually an article in the Times yesterday or something that it also kind of randomly hits a number of sort of like small red state schools that happen to have, for various reasons, large endowments relative to their to their student bodies. And I think I heard that the biggest, like the second biggest endowment in the country is the University of Texas system. university system. And they have, I mean, this just goes to show that how narrowly tailored this is. They've put in some exemptions unless you were founded before 1776, in which case you don't get an so it's basically just there for the, since basically I think either most of the Ivies or all of the Ivies were founded before 1776. I was actually wondering, maybe we can come back to this in a later episode. That almost sounds so arbitrary that I wonder if it's the kind of thing that you might actually uh, be found not viable in constitutional terms, right? There's, I mean, that's a tough case to make, but there are constitutional logics that you can't have something that is purely arbitrary, that is just to target certain people and not others. In any case, those kind of things are the kind of things that tend to get a little more tricky in the Senate, right? You might find some Republican senator who's totally down for everything, but maybe some school in his state is going to get hit and he's got a problem with it or something. So
Yeah,
there
I
you
mean,
go
at
on
this
that.
point, I think you have to put money on them getting it done, right? And it's just it's such a big thing to fail, and you don't have actors like Manchin or Cinema who genuinely didn't care if it
Right.
failed and if it was a huge black mark on their president and their party. Like, they were defining themselves as people who were willing to do that as a huge kind of plus to their public persona.
Yep.
And
Yep.
Republicans, even, Senate ones, and even ones who don't like Trump, are just they're less like that. They're more, in
And they have a bigger
lockstep.
margin. They have a
Right.
bigger margin. So like Murkowski and Collins might do
It
that,
wouldn't get
but it
it
doesn't
done.
matter.
Right.
Yeah.
So, the bigger question is really, can they keep up this pace and get it done and do the debt ceiling as part of it? I mean, I think based on how fast the House moved, that's a good sign for them. They'll
Right.
want to get this done, I think, by early July. So they're kind of far out from the debt ceiling and can kind of get it done safely. And then, as we've discussed, Congress has a really sacred duty to take off for most of the summer. So they can get to that. But I mean, the two ways to look at this, on the one hand, victory for Republicans, right? They're like, they're moving apace on their one big legislative push that they're going to do, and they're avoiding stuff like having the tax cuts expire and having taxes go up right before the midterms. And we'll see what happens in the Senate, but at least as of now, they seem, at a good pace, on track to do that. And then the flip side is, they're going ahead and cutting millions of people off their health care, which that's what Democrats want them to do, right? If there's one topic that even this Democratic leadership is comfortable fighting on, it's cuts to healthcare. That's something they're well versed in, right? You don't have any kind of stupid triangulation of like, oh, maybe people shouldn't go to El Salvador. Like, everyone, even the most, anodyne kind of Democrat you're disappointed in right now, knows how to do that, has had a decade of doing it, is already getting it into the bloodstream. So, that's what Jeffries was kind of his whole thing this morning was like, okay, now you've done it. This is what we're going to run on. This is how we're going to try to define the midterms. Tax cuts for the rich and cuts to your healthcare to pay for it, right? Like, that is the perfect package for even these kind of old school institutionalists still haven't found their footing in the Trump era types.
And it's a pretty good message. Right.
It's
I mean,
worked
it's
before.
not it's not the only message, but to me, and I think most people, at least in theory, agree with this. It's all kind of down to implementation of how people think about these things. But really, what Doge is doing, what the gift of the plane, these are all of a piece. These are, you're taking the government and you are making it run for Trump and his rich friends. And to make it run for Trump and his rich friends, you need to be able to fund at least part of the tax cuts by taking away people's health care. So one of the things that one of the things that I think Democrats have often gotten wrong with tax politics is that, and this has changed to a certain extent as American politics has moved in a more populist direction. But in general, people just don't have that much time to worry about if someone else is getting a tax cut. Like, okay, like, yeah, maybe they shouldn't get a tax cut, but like, am I really going to be furious that this other dude is paying less taxes? It becomes relevant when you say they're paying, they're paying less because they're taking away your health care. And when you start saying like, wait a second, okay, like like that affects me because I see the transaction. Like you can't fly. No one wants to fly to Newark Airport anymore because Elon, fired all the air traffic controllers. Because why? Because I don't, who knows why exactly. But those kind of things are you need that equation, and this is sort of why I think there's always an argument that people it's not a matter of envy. Envy isn't a big political driver. It's just people seeing that other people are who's it all for? Who's it being run for? Is it being run for sort of the average person who needs some help, getting healthcare coverage and stuff, or is it being run for the Elons and the sort of the private equity people? So that's all very powerful, and the Democrats. So we shouldn't poo-poo that is a strong message. I'm not saying you were doing that, Kate, but you do hear that, kind of that it's so anodyne. You just need to weave all of them together because it is all the same story. It's different permutations, same story.
Okay, so we also want to talk about this big report that dropped this week from Catalyst, this Democratic data firm. Basically, they do the big what happened autopsy some months after the elections, and this is using voter file stuff and county data and their own polling and modeling and census data. And it's just like one of the best, most expensive, biggest deep dives into the election because, for the past few months, we've been just dealing with kind of like exit polls, preliminary data. Like it's really hard in general to ever say kind of why someone lost an election. But it is continuously stunning to me given how much money and, importance is staked on elections that we know so little about it. And really at the end, the best you can kind of come away with is an educated guess. But this is one of the best data points for people who try to understand elections and what campaigns did right and wrong. And it is pretty bleak, I have to say. I mean, Harris lost ground basically everywhere, including with college educated people, as well as the more kind of Trumpy segments. I wrote a little where things stand about one of the headlines to me, which is it's stunning the degree to which the hemorrhaging is men in every significant racial group. It's men and basically young men.
Hmm.
That's the case with Black voters, Latino voters, even though there was some slippage with Latinas as well, AAPI voters, white voters. It's all being led. This right wing drift is coming from young men. And that's kind of the top line. The top line of the report is basically the way Democrats have won elections, in the recent era is they do really well with the new voters who are coming into the electorate for the first time, right? And we know that. We know that young people have typically been very left leaning. And that helps make up for the fact that the drop off voters who voted in the last presidential election and then kind of drop out of the electorate for this one, also have historically been a Democratic leaning group, right? And that's why Democrats have liked big turnout elections because they're going for these kind of unreliable, low propensity voters that have traditionally come into their camps. And this year, part of the problem was the amount of people that dropped out, which, had gone for Biden by like 55% or something. The wave of incoming voters was much smaller. You're missing like 4 million people. So even if those incoming voters were the same degree of Democrat friendly, you're not making up the same ground. And they were nowhere near as Democrat friendly as expected. Like historically low support for the Democratic candidate. And then, to kind of put a cherry on top of how everything is so topsy-turvy now, the group that Harris did better than Biden and who had done better than Hillary Clinton with are super voters, which are the ultra reliable voters, which are usually defined as people who have voted in each of the last 4 major elections. And again, this is something we already know to some degree, right? Like, this is why midterms and special elections are now in the Democratic sphere. It's because the Democrats have become the party of like civic responsibility. So people
Yep.
who vote all the time are more Democratic now than they ever have been before. But it does really just change the way that we think about elections, because I think even when there has been proof that there are holes in this theory, the idea of recreating the, quote unquote Obama coalition has had real staying power in Democratic politics, that you want this like really big diverse electorate, with like a lot of young people, and you're trying to activate people who are not these, super voters who always come out, and that you'll win with them. This year was kind of I think a final nail in the coffin of that idea, and which is kind of goes hand in hand with this longtime thesis of the demographics is destiny thing, right? That
Right. Right. Right.
Republicans will ultimately be done in by the idea that their base is white and aging and will just die off eventually. And because Democrats are the party of young people and racial minorities, that eventually that contingent will just swamp the old white people, and that alone will kind of boost Democrats into a permanent position to win. And now
Right.
we're
Right.
seeing that some of these voters that were long considered unpoachable by Republicans are being increasingly amenable to the right wing message, at least in like the Trump era, the last
Right.
few
Right.
elections.
Right. Yeah, it's there are always these ideas people have about permanent majorities of one sort or another, and those are always absurd. There was a lot of this going into and coming out of the 2004 election. Permanent Republican majority obviously wasn't the case, but there's just a thermostatic nature to a two-party system. You get adjustment on one side, and that doesn't happen. I think it was the way I see this is that many people thought, and this was definitely briefly Republican orthodoxy coming out of the 2012 election, that Republicans need to adjust to a different kind of America, one that is not so overwhelmingly white as it has been. Blah 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 blah. That's why you had, Marco Rubio was Mr. Comprehensive Immigration Reform, all that kind of stuff. The To the extent, at least what was not expected, is that at least from a certain perspective, Republicans could start making those inroads while becoming, more of a basically more of a white nationalist party. That didn't seem to make sense, right? That didn't add up. I do think it is Democrats need to look a little under the hood, to the extent that you could, uh, uh, get these, slightly but significantly expanded margins, African American men, Latino men. Clearly, there are there are parts of those communities that do not see this as a more white nationalist Republican Party, and Democrats need to think about why that is the case, right? That's kind of obvious, but this is something that they do need to do some soul searching about. If it really is true, which from through a lot of different prisms it is true, this Trump administration is like strongly white nationalist, very explicitly. You know, you anything they're going through, and anything that is any grants talking about civil rights or racism or even just like black people, right? Just those grants are all canceled. And you've got the president of South Africa coming to the Oval Office, and the president like ambushes him with this kind of like Stormfront white genocide video. Like, whoa, okay, like this is pretty hardcore, and yet that they were able to make those inroads. Clearly there are parts of these communities that are not seeing what we see there, and that needs to be thought about.
Yeah, and some parts of this are difficult. I mean, when you look at the white men for the last 3 elections, they're dropping in support. 2016, they come back a little bit when a woman isn't on the ballot, and then they drop off again in 24, right? I mean, that's a difficult kind of like lesson to take from at least the surface level there.
It is. I mean, it's also, this is always the what is so difficult about interpreting election results is that you have small data sets. It is
Mhm.
absolutely true that, what's different about 2020, there's no woman. That really jumps out, especially when you think about in the history of American politics, those are also the only two times there were any women. So you have that. You also have the fact that was after people had done 4 years under Trump. That's another big factor there. And I'm not saying it's either or, but it's not none of either of those two. So it's hard to there are a lot of different factors. It's always hard to
Right.
interpret these things.
I mean, and the whole thing is muddled because then you look at the graphs for Black men, Latino men, AAPI men, and it's just a steady downslope. In the past 3 elections, the Democratic nominee has lost more support with each passing election. And coming out of the thesis of that of like white men are more misogynistic than men of these other racial groups, like I don't think that's probably right, and it's like that's why it's so hard to draw the conclusions that you kind of have to draw from this stuff, which is, okay, how do you like take action based on this? How do you change campaigns based on this information? Like it's hard because this particular report, there are so many cross-cutting factors here, right? Like she was less likely to do as well as Biden did with men. Okay, and if that man is 18 to 29, and if he lives in a city and if he's black, then even less likely to support her, right? It's like all these kind of like cross cutting identity groups, and as you say, really small sample sizes, and it's so hard to ever get to the bottom of it because even if you could poll all these people, sometimes voters don't tell the truth about why they voted one way. Sometimes they don't even quite know why they voted one way. I mean, that's particularly true when our elections are so decided by people who are paying the barest sliver of attention to what's going on.
Hmm.
So, all of that is bundled up in here. Really, the one segment that she kind of held steady with were the contingent of women that are, college educated women, black women, older women, mostly, where they were for Biden. I mean, mark you, there was not some kind of like huge explosion in support from women when there was a woman on the ballot. We're talking about just not kind of losing support the way that she did with all these various other groups.
Yeah, I mean, I think I mean a couple things. I mean, I don't know if this seems like wishful thinking or something, that when you lose an election, you lose support. That's how you lose the election. So at a certain level, um, did she only hold her own in some? I mean, she lost. Biden won, and she lost. So at we need to. I think it is important to remember that you don't want to you don't want to kind of recapitulate endlessly what is the primary thing, which is she lost. So she lost support relative to Joe Biden. I do think, there's we do see this. One thing that was clear from the very beginning was that uh, a lot of Democratic losses were in their own territory. They actually held up pretty well in the swing states. And there's various things you can draw from that. I mean, that's where they were running a campaign. To the extent that they're, kind of seeing a lot of losses in big blue cities, they weren't running campaigns there. I mean, obviously there were some campaigns, and it depends. Michigan is different from New York. There was obviously a very contested Senate campaign, but there are some basic ways that communities who see themselves as central to, or see them, well, this is the point, they don't see themselves, or at least not as much as they used to. People who Democrats see as sort of the centerpiece of their coalition, and who were living in kind of the bluest areas, weren't impressed, right? If you're talking about young black men in blue cities and they're like, I might vote for Trump. That's something you really need to think about. And I don't think that's complicated. That's complicated.
I do think that's one of my like corniest positive takeaways from the report, which is like turnout in the battleground states is gangbusters and now has been for a few elections. And I think there there is some like positivity to be drawn from that in terms of, as you say, these are where campaigns are being run, but also this is where the voting infrastructure is really strong. You've got a ton of investment in like voter education and, you know, really intense fights being fought against Republicans who try to do the various voter suppression stuff, right? And that
Hmm.
translates all kinds of ways, and just basic court fights, but also then making the Wisconsin Supreme Court really important, right? Like
Yep.
it
Yep.
manifests in all these ways. And I think you also are just building voter muscle memory because these people are told every single time your vote is critical, you're picking the president, and then people are just getting into the habit of voting. So we're getting like over 70% consistently, you know, which is like nice to see in a country which has often taken its voting, its enfranchisement pretty lightly.
Hmm.
And of course you also run into the fact that how do you remedy that in states that are not told that they're important? But maybe you can fix that. Like maybe you can cater to voters even in, you know, deep blue or deep red states and try to hook them in a different way and like build up this reliability in voting. Because, you know, I don't know. I think it's pretty nice. I think it's nice to see that also in some states, like, you know, the more recent ones, say your Georgia or Arizona, also experiencing extremely high turnout, which teaches you that it doesn't really take cycle after cycle after cycle after decade to teach people to keep coming out to vote.
And it's not just coming out to vote. And this is why, I mean, look, there's a lot to be very negative about. I don't find this report that negative or dispiriting to me, because it's basically it's basically kind of why I thought Democrats lost, right? I mean, so it doesn't surprise me. The other thing is that one of the big problems with the relative decline of unions is that unions were a were not just a source of campaign infrastructure and political spending. They were they were communities for the people in which there was dense union penetration, and that swing state voter apparatus, at least to an extent, does something similar. Not nearly as much, but does something similar to the extent that it's not just like getting people memory, muscle memory to vote. It is a lot of intensive education of like when you vote Republicans, these things happen. And when you vote Democratic, these things happen. And one of the other things that I saw in this report that actually make me not that pessimistic is that in a lot of these groups where you see erosion, you actually don't see a rise of an ideological shift or a policy shift that seems to line up with it. You have people who are very disconnected from the political system, have you know they're not getting that intensive voter education that you're getting in the swing states. Now, that's not the entire thing because she lost the swing states, but the delta tells you something. And I think that you need a politics where not just constant voters, but occasional voters know that when you vote for Republicans, people will have their health care taken away from them. Period. You'll have crazy things like tariffs that drive up costs. So, having said all that, it is certainly true that you have some level of deracialization of our politics. I think we have to always remember here. People hear this commentary and they're like, "Wow, black men voted for Trump." Well, no, no, they didn't. That's not the case at all. What you see is the shift, and those shifts are important. To some extent, deracialization is not bad for the country. In fact, it's good for the country. I mean, I always back 20, 30 years ago, and this is a whole other issue about the sort of the devaluation of the black vote. There was this kind of very DC commentary that said, if it weren't for the black vote, Democrats would be toast. They'd never win another election again. And I always thought like, well, okay, like in fact there is a black vote, so let's I'm not sure what that point is exactly, but to the extent that the black vote became less reliably democratic, I would think that would mean that they were thinking they no longer needed the protection of the Democratic Party. And if that is a sustained thing, I would actually, I mean, that wouldn't be great for Democrats, maybe, but that would be positive for the country. Not because I think it's great that we have a deracialized politics. I don't think there's any problem with 90% of black people voting for Democrats. I think that happens because the black community feels its role in American society is one where they need one party that will have their back. In any case, uh, all of these reasons, Democrats have their work cut out for them, but I really think it's about building a politics that seems relevant to people who it has not seemed relevant to. And if you look at the mix of voting behavior and ideology, a lot of these people are a growing population of people who feel alienated from the political system. And when you had an economy that didn't seem great, you had a president who seemed decrepit. They're like, yeah, Trump, let's give Trump a try. That's what happened.
Yeah, I mean, I also think the Republican takeaway from this report is not as rosy as it might appear at first blush. I mean, the best interpretation is Republicans thought they were never going to get Black voters, Latino voters, and any kind of substantive numbers. Actually, this matters even more for the Latino vote because it's such a fast growing
Yep.
part of the electorate. And now they're making inroads, right? And as you say, they didn't have to temper the racism at all, which is like kind of a huge, which is like the glue of the party. So that's
Yep.
all good news for them. But by virtue of Republicans increasingly becoming the party of the low propensity voter, the one that's able to like turn out these people that aren't coming out to every election, right? That don't vote in midterms, that don't vote in special elections, and that might vote in presidential elections, then they're kind of inheriting a problem that Democrats have long faced in elections, which is it's really hard to reach those people. It's
Yep.
really
Yep.
hard to get them to vote. Like low information voters are just not really on the same planet as high ones, and it's expensive, and it's really hard now in a bifurcated media environment where you have to do this kind of like micro targeting to try to get to people. And also, we don't have proof, and in fact, have some amount of proof proving the opposite that these people behave this way when Trump is not on the ballot, right? Like, and the tricky thing is, we haven't had a good presidential comparison to hold up because he keeps fricking running all the time. And then you're just left with these off year elections, which you can explain by the fact that these are infrequent voters.
Right. Right.
But
Right.
it's a huge, maybe the question mark that do these people, when Trump isn't running anymore and he doesn't have this kind of like, cowboy ethos and the anti-establishment thing, do they just drop back out of the electorate? And when it's a more, whoever comes after him is going to be a more standard issue politician, whether it's JD Vance or, one of the sons or whatever, do they keep participating when the allure of Trump is gone? We have no idea about that. And that Republicans are really concerned about it by the way that they keep flirting with the multiple terms thing.
Yeah.
Because like
Yeah.
the best way to avoid what could be a really gigantic problem for Republicans would be, well, just, Trump can keep running forever and he'll never die and he'll keep kind of working this magic with men who otherwise wouldn't vote, and then we win forever.
Yeah. 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 No, I at some level, I think when one looks at these results, it is important to come back to remember that Trump won a plurality win with a very narrow popular vote win, and it is an important corrective that when you look at all these individual things, this group, that group, this group, and yet it was a very, very close election. And again, that's not like wishful thinking or whatever. It puts in. I just think it adds some critical critical context. Look, I think the big thing, the big issue is in my mind is really not ideological. There's very little here you see that points to an ideological shift to the right. What you have is a loss of trust in institutions and in institutions, political movements, and the Trump GOP has that works for them. That works. That general kind of populist lack of trust, that works for them. And so I think for Democrats, and at a certain level, this is a pretty. I'm not sure this is Panglossian of me, because what I'm saying is the biggest lift possible. You need to be coming up with ways to reinvigorate public trust and civic democracy. Now, okay, Josh, I mean, what the fuck? Like, that's like the hardest thing imaginable. But to me, that at least provides me with clarity. And one thing that this sounds like a weird segue. This is why you need to get rid of the filibuster.
Totally.
Because I really think, if you look back on the last 20 years or so, last 25 years or so, the sort of abiding thing is you get these wave elections and kind of not that much happens, right? And people understandably sort of say, "What the fuck, mate? This is bullshit. This doesn't this doesn't mean anything." And that's why, one of the reasons that it's not getting a lot of attention, but one of the reasons that Democrats in the Senate have not been pushing too hard on some stuff is they think if we push too hard, they'll get rid of the filibuster or they'll get rid of the blue slips or whatever those things are called. And to me, I kind of think push as hard as you can. Milk those to block as much fucking stuff as you can. And at a certain point, if they get rid of it, great. Because I think that is actually a long-term plus for civic democracy in this country. Because you need to be able to say, if you get a win, the other guys come in and they do a lot of stuff. And you say, like, okay, I voted and a lot of stuff happened. And if it was the wrong stuff, I'm going to make sure I vote the next time. But
Yeah.
man, I think we uh that to me is just a huge, huge, huge factor. People need to know that there is a very real connection between their political activity and seeing things change.
Yeah, there's no question at all. And of course, we don't have time to get into this. The Supreme Court is also a problem in this theory of the world, but I was talking to someone the other day who was like, I don't get it. It's if you're not a rich person, it's like, Democrats are for the minimum wage and paid family leave. And it's like, well, in theory, they're for those things on the federal level, but they're never able to pass them because of the filibuster, right? And maybe you have, you can look at your state leadership and maybe there get some Democratic loyalty, but Republicans are not leaving the filibuster intact as part of some sacrosanct deal with Democrats. They are leaving the filibuster intact because they know it serves their purposes. They can do tax cuts and they can do judicial
Yeah.
confirmations while the filibuster is intact. And that's all the legislating they're really interested in doing. You can kind of whip up about an abortion ban, and some of the most anti abortion zealots, sure, most of them know the backlash would be intense. And it serves them really well to say, God, I wish we could do an abortion ban. Nothing I want more, but Democrats won't let us. Whereas for Democrats, not having the filibuster would let them pass the wide tranche of legislation that is actually ideologically central to the party, and not having to do these insane contortions to try to get as much of it as possible into this Frankenstein monster reconciliation bill, all of which can be thwarted by like the Senate parliamentarian. There's just no question, and you always come back to this final point of, if Republicans really, really, really wanted to pass something, does anyone actually think they'd be like, well, guys, the Democrats have left this in place when they really wanted to pass things, so we should do it in the name of brotherhood? Really, come on, get over yourselves. If it didn't actively help their interests, it would be gone. They do not fear wielding power the same way that Democrats do. It's insane to me that this is still a debate at all. And that the best kind of counterpoint that Democrats can come to is like, well, Republicans would do things that we don't like. Yeah, for sure, right? And then
And
they'd have to run on
that's
those things and defend them.
and that's also democracy. That is, and you make a very good point at the way that it works for Republicans on both sides. Democrats are the ones who actually want to legislate, and Republicans, as you say, tax cuts and judges, that's good enough. It also helps them on the other side, is that it allows them to not have to deliver on some of their crazy stuff. Because I'd love to do that abortion ban, guys, but we just can't because the filibuster. I'm so sorry. So so in any case, that is, um, we should. It is something that Democrats can get out of this terrible time. Push these obstructionist tools to the absolute limit. Obstruct a ton of stuff, and is there a good chance Republicans will get rid of them? Yes. And that is, it will be a short-term hit, but it'll be a long-term plus. And not just because, oh, we'll get $15 minimum wage. It is and I'm certainly not the only one to say this, but I just think it is so important, it's worth emphasizing. It is in the Democrats' inherent interest for all voters to have a strong sense that their vote, their political activity, will show up in a direct and tangible way in things that happen in the near term. And to the extent that that tether, that sense of connection is broken, it it breaks down the social contract that civic democracy is based on. And so to a great extent, we are in this crisis of civic democracy because of that breakdown. And honestly, it's kind of what some people now call neoliberalism and all these other things, but it's some of it is really structural.
And can I just say, there is this attitude that this fearful posture on the filibuster is like risk free, and that blowing up or goading the filibuster into being blown up is really risky. That we know that's not true, right? We now have evidence showing that voters despise Democrats, right? Like, we have tried the risk averse, let's play by Republican rules and just try to tell people that we need 60 senators to get anything done. It doesn't work. People do not like it. It drives people from the party. Even when your ideas consistently poll better than the other parties, as you say, people will not stick with you if you demonstrate time and time and time again that you run on these popular things and then are unable to execute on them when voters deliver you even a trifecta, right? What you asked for. And, people like me and you can say, well, Joe Manchin, well, Cinema. It's, you have got to, as you say, recreate the tie between what you say you're going to do and what you're able to execute on. And I think that is the direct path into how Democrats retake power, because the ramifications of that central thesis are: you get rid of the filibuster, you try to reform the Electoral College, you add more seats to the Supreme Court, or maybe you wall certain issues off from them. Like, it requires taking, you make DC and Puerto Rico a state as soon as you freaking can, because there is no possible world where, if Republicans had sitting duck states like this, wouldn't have had statehood 10 years ago, right? And the only possible argument against enfranchising those places are, well, we don't want two more Democratic senators. I mean, you have to
4 more
stop.
Democratic senators.
Right. So you
Yeah,
just,
in all likelihood.
they have to recreate that bond. And I think that also gives both the true and the noble kind of cover that Democrats need to stop being so afraid of seizing power by means of getting rid of procedural blockades that 99.9% of this country does not understand to begin with.
Yeah, no, I totally. And this is why I actually, everybody say, oh, the Democratic, popularity of the Democratic Party brand is so damaged and everything. I am, I am totally, I'm fine with that. I'm just, I am, I'm totally buoyant about that. It really doesn't worry me at all, because when you actually look at the numbers, what it is that the Democrats are, for obvious reasons, very unpopular among Republicans. They are very unpopular among Democrats because Democratic voters are upset with the party for these reasons. So what it really is that the people who believe in the policies that Democrats support are upset with them for not fighting hard enough for them, for not fighting as effectively as they should, whatever. That is now, I guess let's put it this way. That is, I was going to say that is an eminently solvable problem. Fight a little harder for your notional policies. To the extent that is not a soluble problem, um, then what's the point? Then, like, kind of, why am I doing this, right? If they, so it's one of the, like, look, in my kind of first acquaintance with politics was in the 1980s. And in the 1980s, going back to what we talked about at the beginning of this thing, young people were not all liberal and progressive. It was quite the opposite. Younger people were quite conservative. And if you looked across the terrain, the country was moving to the right. That was just the fact, right? And it wasn't just like all the different, I mean, it was just a fact. The country was moving to the right. And that is sort of why I think a lot of people today don't entirely get and are so down on New Democrats and triangulation and all that kind of stuff. Yes, there were certainly, in retrospect, there were real negatives to that, but it didn't come out of nowhere. It came out of this very real appreciation of the fact the country isn't buying what we're selling, right? And so, like, if they're not buying what we're selling, we need to play around a little bit at the margins here if we're gonna try to still be reelected. That is not what's happening. That is not what's happening. What is happening is, again, Democratic voters and potential Democratic voters are upset at Democrats not seeming to fight as effectively for their preferred policies and preferred communities they're trying to protect as Republicans. And again, that should be a much more soluble problem. All right, I think we've gotten into some stuff that it's good when we can kind of dig into the things that we uh, uh, believe pretty deeply. We have anything else we should get into for this episode?
No, that's it.
We reached a point of equanimity and calm, having expressed our deeply held views. All right, that is it for this week, and we'll talk to you next week.
See you then. The Josh Marshall podcast is hosted by me, TPM reporter Kate Riga, and TPM founder, editor-in-chief Josh Marshall. The show is produced by Jackie Wilhelm. Thanks to Why Not Jansfeld for our podcast theme song, and thanks to all our TPM members who make this possible. Rate and review us on Apple Podcasts, and subscribe wherever you listen.